Joy to you and me. Speaking of joy, if you enjoyed Archbishop Desmond Tutu and His Holiness the Dalai Lama giggling and laughing and teasing each other, I highly recommend the Book of Joy, which they co-created. And my mom read it and she said, "Who knew the Dalai Lama would giggle so much?" And I thought to myself, well, I would have been able to guess that. I love the joy that the two of those folks share. So I want you to know that I wrote the outline of this sermon on the back of a printout of my car insurance, leaning over the hood of my car, which was the only flat surface I had at hand in a parking lot on a Friday night. It's been that kind of a week. Originally, the topic for this Sunday was soul listening, a gentle, contemplative entry into our spring theme of spiritual practice. But there was very little about this week that was gentle or contemplative. On Tuesday evening, your church leadership and I made the call to suspend in-person worship for the remainder of the month due to the current COVID surge in our community. Not gentle, not contemplative. And in order to allow our fantastic musicians the chance to perform the music that they've been preparing for this Sunday's original topic, I decided to swap this Sunday's topic with another topic from next month, which is our topic today, joy as an act of resistance. And can I just say, I was feeling a bit resistant to joy. But perhaps that is exactly why I get to tackle this topic today. I think it's important to distinguish joy from two other things that get confused for synonyms, pleasure and happiness. In Pleasure Activism, Adrienne Marie Brown writes, "Pleasure reminds us to enjoy being alive and on purpose. Pleasure, embodied, connected pleasure, is one of the ways we know we are free, that we are always free, that we always have the power to co-create the world. Pleasure helps us move through times that are unfair, through grief and loneliness, through the terror of genocide or days when the demands are simply overwhelming. Pleasure heals the places where our hearts and spirits get wounded. Pleasure reminds us that even in the dark, we are alive. Pleasure is a medicine for the suffering that is absolutely promised in life. Feeling good is not frivolous, it is freedom." We can all likely connect to some small pleasure in our recent days. New sheets on the bed, right out of the shower, a perfect blueberry muffin or cup of coffee, the touch of a beloved, the sound of a good friend's voice, a well-played game of Scrabble. Pleasure is often a sensory pursuit, although that is not the only pleasure in the world. But pleasure is not joy, at least not in its entirety, although the way Adrienne Marie Brown describes it comes pretty close. Happiness, according to my therapist, is a little bit more prosaic. She asked me in our first session together to define happiness, and I am proud to say I got a gold star. Happiness has less akin with joy and more with contentment, sufficiency, enough. Happiness is what comes when you have what you need and can imagine what you want. Happiness is not perfection. Happiness is not elation. Happiness is not joy, not in its entirety. Yesterday, many of us watched as a gunman charged into a Sabbath service at Congregation Beth Israel in a Dallas suburb and held people hostage for nearly 12 hours. Not gentle, not contemplative. It has been that kind of week. But for the families of those 5 hostages who were released, no one would use the word happy to describe anything about this situation. But I can't help think that for those families, the terror of the day must have been joined with such a terrible joy upon their return home. Joy has always been a touchstone of my own spirituality, and this topic is near and dear to my own heart. And it was frustrating to feel so far away from it this week at the same time. Surely I thought, I have written something about joy that I can use as a jumping off point that would take me back to a place where joy felt accessible. Surely I had done joy at some point or another in my sermonating career. So I did what every good minister does, and I did a file search of my sermon files on my computer, looking through the various things I'd written for that crucial little 3-letter word, and found it absolutely peppering my work. Good. So far, so good. But as I looked, even though references to having joy, experiencing joy, the value of joy, joy as a spiritual practice, joy being central to the work of worship, and joy as part of the vitality of spiritual community, I couldn't find a kernel of a place to start. I had talked about it, but it felt like I had said nothing. Back to the drawing board. In his essay titled "Joy is Such a Human Madness," the poet Ross Gay writes, "What if the wilderness, perhaps the densest wild in there, thickets, bogs, swamps, ravines, and rivers. Have I made my metaphor clear? What if the wilderness is our sorrow, our what is intolerable? It astonishes me sometimes, often, how every person I get to know, everyone, regardless of everything, by which I mean everything, lives with some profound personal sorrow, rejected by their family, brother addicted, mother murdered, dad died in surgery, the cancer came back, evicted, my baby's not okay. Everyone, regardless, always of everything. Not to mention the existential sorrow we all might be afflicted with, which is what we and what we love will lose. Is this sorrow, of which our impeding being no more might be the foundation? Is this sorrow the great wilderness to explore? And if it is, and if we join in exploring our sorrow, if we join our sorrows together, yours and mine, what is that? For joining, too, is a kind of annihilation of solitude. What if we joined our sorrows? What if that is joy? I think about Archbishop Desmond Tutu and His Holiness the Dalai Lama joining their sorrows together, and they certainly have them, but no one can deny that they also have great joy, perhaps because of their sorrows themselves. All will be well. All will be well. All manner of things will be well. Julian of Norwich, in the midst of both her suffering and her ecstasy, because remember, while her body was racked with pain, she was given divine revelation. This speaks to me. It speaks to us still. We will hear those words again, all will be well, from UU minister and musician Reverend Meg Barnhouse in a song after this sermon, imagining a conversation between Meg and Julian about how to face the sorrow of living in a world with cruelty and pain and ignorance and injustice. Because that's the world we live in. And that's the world joy lives in too. It is possible, I think, that the ecstasy of joy would not exist in a world of total happiness. When I think of joy, I think of a fluttering feeling in my stomach. And when I think of fear, I also think of a fluttering in my stomach. Isn't that odd? Joy is such a human madness. The title of the essay I read from earlier, and it comes from an essay by Zadie Smith. And that essay concludes, sometimes joy multiplies itself dangerously. Children are an infamous example. Isn't it bad enough that the beloved with whom you have experienced genuine joy will eventually be lost to you? Why add the nightmare, the child whose loss, if it ever happened, would be nothing less than your total grief? It should be noted that an equally dangerous joy for some people is the dog or the cat. Relationships with animals, in some sense, intensified by their finitude. You hope to leave this world before your child, but we can be quite certain, for most of us, your dog will leave before you do. Joy is such human madness. The writer Julian Barnes, about mourning, once said, "It hurts just as much as it is worth." For months afterward, these words stuck with me. So clear, so brutal. It hurts just as much as it is worth. What an arrangement. Why would anyone accept such a crazy deal? Joy hurts as much as it is worth. Joy is a holistic emotion. It does not reside simply in the places of pleasure and comfort and happiness. Joy resides in a juxtaposition. The world is beautiful. The world is terrible. And still, the world is beautiful. To paraphrase Viktor Frankl, who knew quite a bit about the excesses of cruelty in Nazi concentration camps, joy is to say yes to life in spite of everything. To welcome joy is to welcome loss, because joy is fleeting. Joy is love and hope and determination and heartbreak and completely, utterly worth it. And joy can be found if we welcome it. Earlier in the service, I invited you into a spiritual practice, a body prayer, one that I hope you will bring into your life this week and tell me how it goes. But on a larger scale, the larger challenge is a spiritual practice of welcoming joy. And part of this is welcoming what our contributor Nathaniel Drew referred to as shadow work. Because very often the thing that keeps us from feeling that immediate sense of joy is fear and dread. And we start by asking ourselves, what am I afraid of? How am I altering things in my life, my actions and decisions out of this fear? Some fear is justified. A lot of fear is justified, and none of it is wrong. I encourage you to think about these questions. What do I fear existentially? How does that fear affect my actions and decisions? What can I learn from that about the work that is mine to do so that I can welcome joy when I see it? I encourage you to think about those questions. And if you'd like to think about them with me, I encourage you to set up an appointment for 30 minutes or even an hour on Calendly to share them with me, because I, too, ask myself those questions as a way of figuring out what is mine to do. Which brings me back to the hood of my car last Friday night, scribbling notes in the fading light of an absolutely gorgeous sunset over Lake Conroe. I had just driven to our coordinator of religious education's house, Galen and Connie's house. I had just driven to drop off her laptop which she had lived with the church. And I just driven up there for the second time, the drive, not the dropping off. The first time, I forgot the laptop. It's been that kind of week. But on that second drive, I started sorting out all the ideas I had for this Sunday. I do that when I drive. It's one of the reasons working from home is tough for me, is I don't get my drive back and forth to work. So on that drive, I started kind of sorting out, sifting out all of the different ideas and wondering about my fruitless file search through my old writing. And I started to really doubt myself. Had I preached about joy? Had I shared this? Had I written about joy? Was Windows File Explorer gaslighting me completely? Or had I forgotten to tell you about this very, very important thing? And then I remembered what an old minister of mine had said to me once. Everybody has one sermon that they keep preaching over and over and over again. One of the gifts of the pandemic was the revelation of what my one sermon was. And I commemorated it with a little bit of embroidery, which brings me a lot of joy. Courtesy of Miss Frizzle. Take chances, make mistakes, and get messy. And then it hit me. I had not ever done the joy sermon. And joy was far from done with me. Because if I have only one sermon to give, joy is that sermon. Joy keeps hope spinning. Joy gives sorrow an edge that can bring healing. Joy gives pleasure its depth and its breadth. Joy is an antidote to fear, to despair, to hopelessness. Joy reminds us that we are human in inhuman moments. Joy is how we remind ourselves that life is about saying yes in spite of everything. I hope you will join me in welcoming it. Our closing music, while not technically our hymn today, is one that many of us might be familiar with, and I invite you